While history books celebrate the Islamic Golden Age of science, mathematics, and culture, they rarely mention what happened to the millions who refused to convert during the rapid expansion of Islamic caliphates. The documented practices of medieval Islamic empires toward conquered peoples make European medieval warfare look merciful by comparison. What you're about to discover comes from historical sources written by Arab chroniclers themselves, not just their enemies. These practices were systematic policies of conquest that shaped the medieval world and erased entire civilizations from history. From the systematic theft of children to create slave armies to the complete cultural destruction of ancient civilizations, Islamic caliphates perfected methods of conquest that went far beyond simple military victory. They understood that breaking the spirit of conquered peoples was more effective than just occupying their lands. The Ottoman Empire created one of history's most systematic child trafficking operations disguised as a tax collection system. The devshirme, or blood tax, required Christian families in the Balkans to surrender their sons to the Sultan. Every few years, Ottoman officials would sweep through Christian villages, selecting boys between 8 and 18 years old based on physical strength and intelligence. Parents were forced to watch their children being taken away, knowing they would never see them again. Resistance meant death for the entire family. These boys were then transported to Istanbul, forcibly converted to Islam, and subjected to intensive military training designed to erase their previous identities. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages, contacting their families, or practicing their original religion. The most promising were trained as janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry corps. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and brutal. Boys were taught that their Christian families had abandoned them while the Sultan had saved them from ignorance. They were given new names, new histories, and new loyalties. Many genuinely believed they owed everything to the Ottoman system that had enslaved them. The scale was staggering. Historical records suggest that between 1365 and 1826, when the system was finally abolished, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million Christian boys were taken from their families. Entire regions of the Balkans lived in constant terror of the next collection. The cruel irony was that these stolen children became the primary force used to conquer more Christian lands. Former Christians were used to destroy Christian communities, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of conquest and conversion. The devshirme wasn't just about creating soldiers. It was about breaking the spirit of Christian communities. By taking their strongest and brightest sons and turning them into enemies, the Ottomans ensured that resistance would be both practically and psychologically impossible. Families developed desperate strategies to protect their children. Some would deliberately injure their sons to make them unsuitable for selection. Others would hide them in remote areas during collection periods. But the Ottoman system was thorough, and few children escaped once they were identified. While the Atlantic slave trade lasted roughly 400 years, the Islamic slave trade operated for over 400 years, from the 7th century until the early 20th century. Conservative estimates suggest that 11 to 17 million Africans were enslaved and transported to Islamic lands, but the true number was likely much higher. The Islamic slave trade differed from the Atlantic trade in one crucial and horrifying way: systematic castration. Between 80 and 90% of male slaves destined for Islamic markets were castrated either before transport or upon arrival. The mortality rate from this procedure was approximately 90%, making it essentially a death sentence. The castration centers of the Islamic world were industrial-scale operations. The main center in Aswan, Egypt, processed thousands of boys and men annually. Those who survived the procedure became eunuchs forever marked as less than human and incapable of reproduction. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate policy. Islamic law permitted slavery, but encouraged the freeing of slaves, especially those who converted to Islam. By preventing slaves from reproducing, Islamic societies ensured a constant demand for new captives while avoiding the complications of a large permanent slave population. Female slaves faced a different but equally brutal fate. The most attractive were selected for harems and concubinage, while others were used for domestic labor. Unlike in the Americas, where slave families could form and reproduce, Islamic slavery was designed to prevent the development of slave communities. The Mamluk system took this to an extreme. Young boys primarily from the Caucasus and Central Asia were purchased as slaves converted to Islam and trained as elite warriors. These Mamluks eventually became so powerful they overthrew their masters and ruled Egypt and Syria for over 250 years. But they maintained the system, continuously importing new slave soldiers, rather than allowing their own children to inherit power. The economic impact was devastating for source regions. Entire areas of Africa were depopulated by slave raids. The constant warfare required to capture slaves destroyed local economies and prevented development. Some regions never recovered from centuries of systematic human trafficking. Arab chroniclers like Al-Tabari and Ibn Battuta wrote matter-of-factly about slave markets and castration procedures, treating them as normal aspects of economic life. The scale and systematic nature of these operations were considered unremarkable by contemporary Islamic writers. The psychological impact on families and communities was profound. Islamic caliphates developed sophisticated systems for destroying other religions while maintaining plausible deniability about forced conversion. The dhimmi system created legal frameworks that made non-conversion economically and socially unsustainable. The jizya or poll tax on non-Muslims was deliberately set at levels that would bankrupt most families. In many regions, the tax was equivalent to several months' income, making it impossible for all but the wealthiest to pay. The collection process was designed to be humiliating. Dhimmis had to present themselves publicly, often being struck or forced to kneel while paying. But taxation was just one tool. The systematic destruction of religious infrastructure was equally important. When Arabs conquered Egypt in 641 AD, they began a centuries-long campaign of destroying Coptic monasteries and churches. These weren't just religious buildings. They were centers of learning that contained the last remnants of ancient Egyptian knowledge and culture. The conquest of Persia saw similar destruction. Zoroastrian fire temples, some of which had burned continuously for over 1,000 years, were systematically extinguished. Zoroastrian texts were burned, and priests were executed or forced to convert. Within a few centuries, a religion that had dominated the Persian Empire for over a millennium was reduced to a tiny minority. Mahmud of Ghazna's campaigns in India between 1000 and 1027 AD represent perhaps the most systematic religious destruction in history. His chroniclers boasted that he destroyed over 50,000 Hindu temples and forced millions to convert at sword point. The famous Somnath Temple, one of Hinduism's holiest sites, was demolished, and its fragments were used to build steps for a mosque. The destruction wasn't random vandalism, it was calculated psychological warfare. By destroying the physical symbols of other religions, Islamic conquerors demonstrated the powerlessness of other gods and the supremacy of Islam. Forced conversions often took place in the ruins of destroyed temples, reinforcing the message of Islamic dominance. Legal restrictions made practicing other religions increasingly difficult. Christians and Jews were forbidden from building new churches or synagogues, ringing bells, or conducting public processions. They couldn't testify against Muslims in court, carry weapons, or ride horses. These restrictions created a system of legal apartheid that made non-Muslims second-class citizens in their own lands. The cumulative effect was devastating. Ancient Christian communities in North Africa, which had produced theologians like Augustine, disappeared entirely. The Zoroastrian population of Persia, once numbering in the millions, was reduced to fewer than 200,000 worldwide today. Entire religious traditions that had existed for millennia were erased from their homelands. Islamic caliphates institutionalized sexual slavery on a scale that dwarfed other historical examples. The harem system wasn't just about the pleasure of rulers, it was a systematic method of breaking conquered peoples through the sexual exploitation of their women. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, celebrated in the Arabian Nights, maintained a harem of over 2,000 women. They were captured women from across the Islamic world, kept as sexual property, and discarded when they aged or fell from favor. When Baghdad fell to the Mongols in 1258, the last Abbasid caliph's harem contained over 700 women. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic rape and murder of these women as the city burned, ending centuries of institutionalized sexual slavery in the Abbasid capital. The concubinage system created a legal framework for sexual exploitation. Concubines had no rights and could be bought, sold, or given away like any other property. Their children were considered illegitimate and had no inheritance rights unless specifically acknowledged by their fathers. Slave markets throughout the Islamic world specialized in the sale of women for sexual purposes. Ibn Battuta's travel accounts describe markets in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, where women were displayed naked for inspection by potential buyers. The most attractive commanded prices equivalent to several years' wages for skilled workers. The psychological impact on families was devastating. Parents knew that attractive daughters faced a high risk of being captured and sold into sexual slavery. Some families deliberately scarred their daughters' faces to make them less desirable to slave raiders. Others kept daughters hidden indoors, creating a culture of female seclusion that persists in some regions today. The system created a constant demand for new captives. Unlike wives who retained their status throughout their lives, concubines were frequently replaced as they aged. This meant that slave raids specifically targeted young women, devastating the demographic structure of conquered regions. The scale of sexual slavery was enormous. The Ottoman Empire alone is estimated to have enslaved over 1.5 million women for sexual purposes between the 14th and 19th centuries. These women came from the Balkans, the Caucasus, Africa, and Central Asia, representing dozens of different cultures and ethnicities. Islamic law provided religious justification for these practices. Quranic verses about those whom your right hand possesses were interpreted to permit unlimited sexual access to female slaves. Religious scholars developed elaborate legal frameworks that regulated the buying, selling, and use of sex slaves while maintaining that the system was divinely sanctioned. The impact on conquered communities was profound. The systematic removal of young women disrupted family formation and cultural transmission. Many communities never recovered from the demographic damage caused by centuries of sexual slavery. Islamic caliphates perfected economic warfare as a tool of conquest and control. The goal wasn't just to extract wealth from conquered peoples, but to systematically destroy their economic capacity and force dependence on Islamic rulers. The kharaj, or land tax imposed on conquered territories, was deliberately set at confiscatory levels. In many regions, the tax consumed 50 to 80% of agricultural output, leaving farmers barely enough to survive. When farmers couldn't pay, their land was confiscated and given to Muslim settlers or converted into waqf religious endowment property. The Umayyad conquest of Persia provides a clear example of systematic economic destruction. The sophisticated Sasanian irrigation systems, which had supported Persian agriculture for centuries, were deliberately destroyed or allowed to decay. This wasn't accidental neglect. It was calculated policy designed to prevent economic recovery and force dependence on Arab rulers. Tribute demands often included quotas of people rather than just goods. The Nubians were required to provide 400 slaves annually to the Fatimid Caliphate. The Bulgars had to supply young men for military service. These human tributes devastated local populations while providing the caliphates with a steady supply of forced labor. Trade restrictions created economic apartheid. Non-Muslims were often prohibited from engaging in certain types of commerce or forced to pay additional taxes on their business activities. This gradually transferred economic control to Muslim merchants and impoverished non-Muslim communities. The cumulative effect was the systematic impoverishment of conquered peoples. Regions that had been prosperous for centuries became economic backwaters within a few generations of Islamic conquest. The goal was to make resistance economically impossible while creating incentives for conversion to Islam. Islamic caliphates didn't just conquer territories. They systematically erased the cultures and identities of conquered peoples. This cultural genocide was so thorough that entire civilizations simply vanished from historical memory. The destruction of libraries and centers of learning was systematic and deliberate. When Arabs conquered Alexandria, they destroyed what remained of the famous library that had been the intellectual center of the ancient world. Similar destruction occurred in Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, where Persian royal libraries containing centuries of accumulated knowledge were burned. Language suppression was a key tool of cultural destruction. Arabic was imposed as the language of administration, education, and religion throughout conquered territories. Local languages were gradually marginalized and eventually forgotten. Coptic, the last form of ancient Egyptian, survived only in religious contexts before disappearing entirely from daily use. The renaming of cities, regions, and geographical features was part of a systematic effort to erase pre-Islamic history. Ancient names with thousands of years of history were replaced with Arabic alternatives. This wasn't just administrative convenience. It was deliberate historical erasure. Religious festivals and cultural practices were systematically suppressed. The Persian New Year celebration of Nowruz was banned in many regions. Hindu festivals were prohibited in conquered Indian territories. Local customs that had defined communities for centuries were declared un-Islamic and eliminated. The destruction of monuments and architectural heritage was equally systematic. Pre-Islamic temples, palaces, and monuments were demolished or converted into mosques. The message was clear: the past was worthless, and only Islamic culture had value. Educational systems were completely restructured. Traditional schools that had transmitted local knowledge and culture for generations were closed or converted into madrasas that taught only Islamic subjects. This broke the chain of cultural transmission and ensured that younger generations grew up ignorant of their heritage. The results were devastating and permanent. Ancient Egyptian civilization, which had survived Persian, Greek, and Roman conquest while maintaining its essential character, was completely erased within a few centuries of Arab conquest. Zoroastrian Persia, with its rich literary and philosophical traditions, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The scale of cultural destruction was so complete that we're still discovering what was lost. Archaeological excavations regularly uncover evidence of sophisticated civilizations that were systematically destroyed and forgotten. Entire chapters of human history were erased by Islamic conquest. The Islamic caliphates created one of history's most efficient systems of conquest and cultural destruction. Their methods were so effective that entire civilizations simply vanished from historical memory, leaving behind only archaeological fragments and scattered references in surviving texts. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Millions of people were enslaved, killed, or forced to abandon their cultures and identities. Ancient civilizations that had survived multiple conquests and invasions were completely erased within a few centuries of Islamic expansion. The systematic nature of these practices reveals that they weren't random acts of violence or cultural misunderstanding. They were calculated policies designed to break the spirit of conquered peoples and ensure that resistance would be impossible. The combination of military conquest, economic warfare, cultural destruction, and systematic enslavement created a system of domination. Understanding these historical practices helps us recognize patterns of cultural destruction that continue today. The methods may change, but the goal remains the same: the complete erasure of alternative ways of life and the imposition of a single dominant culture.